take it apart in my head the way you unpick a knot. Deliberately, patiently, because namming every small motion makes the danger feel less like a sentence meant to swallow you and more like an object you can hold and examine. The archive at night is refrigeration for memory. The fluorescent lights hum like distant recitation. The stacks smell of vellum and chapel wax, and everything under those lights behaves as if it knows secrets it need not share. I was hired to catalogue, wrap missals, rebox brittle folios, stamp accession numbers, and this unromantic work becomes its own kind of liturgy, tidy, clerical, morally neutral. That is how they keep you. They give you the comfort of routine so that you will not mind carrying other people's things. Matteo calls names the way a curate recites intercessions. Slow, careful, as if each syllable were a small relic. He is small and exact, a man who has been given the custody of other people's pasts and learned to treat them like inventory. He wears a thin ring with a cross so worn that the metal has a dull black softness. Light dies against it. When he asked if I had returned anything misplaced, I lied, because the truth felt like the beginning of a confession I was not prepared to give. I told myself I would put the tape back, return it to the burn bin the next week, small lies that feel almost honorable until they do not. I listened to the cassette in a rented room above a takeaway, the radiator thrumming like a tired heart. When I first press play, I expect static, the muffled cadence of an old sermon. Instead, the sound unpacks into something more cunning. There is my voice, or a voice that matches mine, reciting the Lord's Prayer in a cadence I do not recognize. The prayer folds, and then the tape begins to list names as if reading an inventory. Maria, Remit, 12, 11, 03, Paulo Seal, 05, 07, 88, Jamal K, Remit, 18, 09, 97. Each name comes with a marginal note spoken aloud, an instruction in a language that seems to have been invented by clerks who needed absolution to be traceable. The voice slips Latin rubrics between phrases. Misericordia pro oblivione, not quite canonical but legally neat, tidy as a ledger. I should have stopped the first time a name on the tape matched someone I had loved. Julia's name makes the tape hiss then close like a lid. In that moment, the street lamp outside my window goes out. The room becomes thin, and I can hear the radiator holding its breath as if it too listens. When a recording can call a city's light to answer, curiosity crosses into something else. But I do not stop. I begin to cross-reference the names with parish registers and municipal ledgers, because that is the vice of my trade. When a text makes a claim, you verify it. Verification is how you pretend to be rational while the irrational rearranges itself. After a week of listening, the city rearranges itself to match what the tape names. Statues in the piazza look more like they have been carved to bear witness than shrine to piety. Votive candles gutter at hours when no one tends them. A child in the next building begins reciting an antiphon that is not taught on street corners. I pass Matteo in the market, and he watches me with an expression that reads like pity or calculation, and says, in the particular dryness of men who have been forced to choose, "Some things are kept so others may be spared." He taps the ledger beneath his blotter as if it were the pulse of an office. The tap makes a rhythm I cannot ignore. I am a man who believes in documentation, and that is why I go to the priest. The young priest who agrees to hear me listens with the professional attention of someone familiar with error and contrition. He will not speak until I put the cassette on the table between us. He presses play, and when the recording finishes, he sits very still and says, "This is a last confession, recorded." He pronounces it like a file label. He tells me there are internal procedures, that mercy sometimes is issued administratively, as if compassion can be parceled, accounted, and tallied. He speaks the words with a kind of bureaucratic tenderness that makes me nauseous. I try to burn the cassette because destruction feels like agency. I light a match in a friend's hearth in a kitchen that smells of lemon and soap, and I watch the plastic blister and curl. The ribbon blackens and resists, and when I rake the coals there is a smear of soot that, for a fraction of a second, resembles handwriting. Fire consumes the object, but not the architecture it taught me to read. You cannot unhear your name when a recording has pronounced it. Each time I say the names aloud, they settle under the skin like tally marks. I should have stopped when Matteo slid a narrow ledger across his desk and did not speak. Silence is accusation in the hands of an archivist. The ledger is thin as a wound and smells faintly of smoke. Under my name, someone has penciled marginalia that look like entries of status. Remit, seal, forget. There is a date beside the entry that I do not recognize, and when I ask what it means, he gives me the look of a man who has practiced mercy as if it were an accounting method. We keep lists, he says. It is how we balance things. He treats my ignorance as a procedural inconvenience rather than a moral emergency. I tell you this because speech is a prophylactic of sorts. Confession distributes the hazard. If I am to be catalogued, let it be among witnesses. I have not slept well. The city sounds like ledger lines now, a low arithmetic that counts down. I keep thinking I can outpace the ink, that by knowing I can shield myself from being consumed, but knowledge has its own appetite. The tape taught me there is such a thing as mercy that requires forgetting, that mercy asks names be struck from registers, lives removed so the rest may breathe. I should have stopped when I first heard my name read aloud, but I kept listening, and now I understand that the ledger writes in the present and will want another name. I press my ear to the cassette player because that is how I have always tried to understand things. Close, intent, believing proximity will reveal causality. The room above the takeaway smells of oil and old paper. Outside, a distant motor coughs, and somewhere down the block, a radio plays a garbled station that loops a commercial jingle like a question mark. When I press play, the familiar prayer begins. My prayer, the cadence of my parents' living room, the syllables that soothe childhood fever. And then the voice slips. The words fold inward and become something else. That small, familiar accent I carried as a child bends the Latin. The Lord's Prayer is present, but hollowed, an instruction left to rot and reassembled into a directive. I sit very still because there is something obscene about hearing your younger self issue commands you never chose to speak. At first I think it is a trick of memory. Memory is a sly editor. It will rearrange the useless and hoard the useful until both feel like artifacts. But the voice is unmistakably mine. The infant sibilance that predates my adult vowels, the tiny hitch I lost when I learned to speak correctly. It is me saying words I never learned to pronounce that way, pressing ecclesiastical Latin into the shape of a compass. Between psalm tones, there are rubrics I do not know, bits of liturgical instruction that have been turned into imperative sentences, rubrics that sound like coordinates. Misericordia pro oblivioni, the tape says, as if reading a bank ledger, and then, with the patient cadence of a registrar, it stitches a sigil into the silence. The sigil is not drawn, it is spoken, and the syllables themselves seem to map the city in my head. I should have stopped the first evening the tape made the street radio die. The jingle outside cuts off mid-chorus as the cassette hisses, as if the recording can push into the city and press mute. The silence that follows is a presence. It presses at the walls and makes the radiator seem louder, a metronome measuring my breath. Instead of turning the cassette off, I slow the playback and replay the broken line until my throat has an ache that is not from cold. I repeat the phrase in the dark until the Latin clots at the back of my mouth and I taste rust. But I kept reading. That is what I warn myself about later, how a small compulsion becomes a command. Curiosity, once given a lane, extends like ivy and finds purchase everywhere. There is a list on the tape like a ledger, but it is not names in the sequence I expect. Instead, there are coordinates stitched to sacramental actions. Secer ad primum nocturnum, aqua nihil, verba omnia, nomen omnia. The syntax treats people like topographical features and rituals like tools to be used upon them. I take notes because that is what I know to do. I translate the Latin, I search parish archives for references to the terms, and I map the places mentioned. The mapping comforts me in the way mapping always comforts. I can arrange chaos into columns and call that sanity. My friend Lucia reads the phrases and goes pale. This is not liturgy, she says when I show her the transcript. It borrows the grammar, but someone has cut the rubrics with a razor and restitched them into directives. Whoever recorded this was making a language to perform an action. She tells me to destroy the cassette. I should have listened. I should have listened because friends are often the first line of defense against our own stubbornness. Instead, I hide the tape in the false bottom of a shoebox and plan to sleep for an hour and then finish translating. I tell myself that knowledge is armor, that if I name the processes, I will be immune to their power. The tape disproves me with extraordinary patience. Night after night, the tape rewrites the city's margins. A church bell peals twice at odd hours. A neighbor's toddler begins to hum an antiphon he could not have learned. A stray dog chews at the corners of the cathedral's stonework until a mason patches the place with fresh mortar as if to close a wound someone keeps opening. The grammary of the tape begins to annotate the living. Fear, strangely, arrives as footnotes. I begin to dream of ink running into gutters, of ledger paper dissolving and leaving letters stamped on skin. I wake certain my younger voice was used as a template, arranged like an architect's drawing, and then read aloud until the drawing matched flesh. How does a recording contain a childhood? Who took those syllables and made them into an instrument? I run parish registries and civic ledgers. I cross-list dates the tape pronounces with baptisms and funerals. I find, with a kind of slow, sick arithmetic, overlaps that should not be possible. Somewhere between a priest's margin note and a municipal clerk's, stamp and apparatus is humming, and my voice is one of its parts. The more I listen, the less convinced I am that I am merely a reader of this text. At some point, the grammar begins to do the reading for me. I find myself in the confessionals listening to the walls and not the priest, hearing the whisper of clauses as if the building itself is footnoted to the same ledger. I tell myself I can stop. I say aloud to the empty room, I should have stopped when the radio died, because the phrase makes me feel prudent, like an oath against curiosity. But I kept reading, and the phrase sits in my mouth like a bitter wafer. The tape offers no absolution, only instruction. It lays out, like a surgeon's chart, the act it requires and the price it exacts. Tonight the cassette says a new thing. Oratio reversa, nomen recipit. The translation, reversed prayer, the name receives, is a sentence that is both a promise and a verdict. A light goes out across the city, as if a votive flame has been pinched, and I hear the faint mechanical click of a clock that has been wound wrong. I am writing this with hands that shake, because I still hope that writing will bind what the tape unbinds, that words on a page are an arc against erasure. I tell you this because if my voice becomes a ledger and someone else reads it back, then perhaps we will not be alone when the prayers turn into calls and the call answers with my child's cadence. And now, I do not know who will speak next with my child's voice for now. I return the box the way you return something trivial, because calling it trivial makes the guilt lighter for a moment. The archive smells like the things it saves. Lemon oil on the wood, the iron tang of old staples, and the lingering scent of paper that had been too close to flame. Matteo is at his desk, ledger open, pencils arranged like a small, impatient army. When the cardboard touches his blotter, I notice the ring first, a band of dull metal on his finger that seems to swallow the overhead light rather than reflect it. It has no inscription I can see. It looks like a token whose meaning has been boiled down to habit. He asks provenance questions with the calm, ordinary cadence of someone whose job is to render disorder legible. Where was it found? Any water damage? Donor identified? I answer the neat, protective phrases I have practiced. Night shift, courtyard leak, no donor mark. Because rehearsed answers make you feel like an employee rather than an accomplice. His pen taps a steady metronome against the blotter as he listens. When I say the word cassette, there is a small change in his face, not a shock, but like the tightening of a hinge. He rubs the ring between thumb and forefinger in a motion I interpret as absent-mindedness until I realize it is a practiced ritual. He tells me about the nuncio in a voice that makes the disappearance sound like a footnote, a carriage that never reached its destination, an unbroken seal, a ledger altered at the margins. He uses the word countdown, softly, as if namming an appointment, and the syllable lands like a pebble thrown into still water. When a man in a repository office says countdown, you realize language can be repurposed into instruments. The word stops being a metaphor and becomes a mechanism. I should have closed my mouth then, left the ledger on his desk, and walked out into the street. Instead, I asked who had seen the cassette before me, which committees had signed off, whether the item had been recorded as interdicted. He slides a sheet toward me like a map instead of a file, and the page is dense with marginalia. Names crossed and recrossed, dates looped, shorthand notes I do not know. My name appears more than once. Beside one entry in a cramped hand, someone has penciled recursus. Beside another, sequela. He explains, without the bedside manner I would hope for, that recursus means recurrence and sequela means consequence. The language of the ledger is clinical, remitted, sealed, sequenced. The paper smells faintly of ash and something chemical. Anyone who works with old texts knows the smell of burned pages, the way ash lingers in a room like a bad memory. He lifts the tape and turns it in his fingers the way a priest cradles a relic. There is a tenderness in the motion that I find inexplicable because tenderness has not been part of the archive's vocabulary for me. The place teaches you to look at objects as records, not as things you can touch kind-heartedly. The label bears a faint abrasion, an initial carved into the plastic, half visible and accusing in equal measure. My initial. Seeing it is like finding a signature in the margin of your life. I feel exposed in a way that is not shame, but a disorientation. Someone else has indexed me, and now I appear in their pages. It is useful, he says, as if he were explaining cataloguing to an intern. Voices are records. A child's voice is particularly useful. It holds patterns. He mentions cadence and rhythm, and the way prelinguistic speech maps an ear to a habit. When he speaks of invocation, it is in the same neutral tone he uses for conservation techniques. His words make the practice sound like a craft. Gather phrases, establish the hook, perform with fidelity. It is chilling because the logic is bureaucratic. The cruelty is in its administrative neatness. He speaks of interdiction as if it were sanitation. You quarantine, you mark, you schedule review. He does not say the ledger decides, but his fingers make the motion of decision as he points to entries. We mark things so mercy can be measured, he says, and the sentence is not pious so much as procedural. There is a rhythm to the office. File, review, remit, seal, that sounds like an arithmetic of lives. He taps the ledger with his pen as if to indicate a beat. The ring on his finger, motionless now, looks less like ornament and more like a badge. When he taps it with the pen, the metal makes almost no sound, as if the world swallowed the noise. I should have stopped. The thought returns with the steady insistence of a bell. I should have stopped when he said countdown, when he first touched the ledger and the paper smelled of ash, when my initial showed up on the tape like a name on a death list. Instead, I pressed for policy. I asked whether errors were possible, whether appeals were permitted, as if the ledger could be negotiated like a tax form. He answered with a patient clarity that made his decisions feel inevitable. Sometimes names are remitted, sometimes they recur, sometimes they are sequenced into other lists and sealed. The procedural language made erasure sound like a clerical act. When I leave the archive, the ring's shadow falls across the stone as if marking my path. The city seems ordinary, the fountain, the trams, people hurrying with grocery bags. But there is an ink-dark sense under everything now, a margin that someone has begun to annotate. At home that night, I set the ledger on my kitchen table, the paper fluttering under the lamp like a thing with a pulse, and I try to imagine the arithmetic of mercy. Who makes these calculations? What criteria decide whether a name is remitted or sequenced? I think of the nuncio and the sealed carriage, and of Matteo's small, professional smile, as if he had read my name in a book only he could open. He smiled when he told me about the countdown, as if the sentence were part of a prayer he had memorized. He smiled in the way a man smiles when he already knows the answer you are about to ask. I should have stopped then. Instead, I kept asking. What did he read inside my life? The vault below the vestry has the patience of a confessor. It waits while you tell it things you are not yet ready to own. At midnight, Domenico meets me under a single swinging bulb, his coat buttoned like a man who has learned the utility of restraint, and the room feels like one of those church spaces meant to be entered slowly, as if any haste would offend the architecture. He does not smile at first. His face is an instrument calibrated to register only what is necessary. He calls the categories sacral, profane, and interdicted the way a librarian lists genres: neutral, unsentimental; sacral for things everyone may touch; profane for things to be preserved but not venerated; interdicted for objects that behave as if they possess will. An interdicted object, he says, is not merely dangerous, it is performative. It does not sit quietly in a box. It alters the room and rearranges the way people pronounce names. He explains that the tape I brought is interdicted because its sentences have been arranged to read like weather reports, and when recited, those meteorological metaphors become directives. Chance of rain corresponds to benediction. Clear skies means remission. Incoming storm signals an anathema. Scripture translated into operations. He taps the ledger and shows me parallel entries, broadcasts next to sacramental ordinances, each stamped with a small industrial seal. Folio smells of old wax and ash. The marginalia are clerical shorthand: recensus, remit, sequela, beside dates and seal impressions that bruise the fibers. Domenico treats seals with reverence, not devotion but caution. Someone taught him to honor the mechanism that turns a decision into record. Records, he says, make eradication legible. If you annihilate something without procedure, you invite rumor. If you schedule remediation, you render the loss managerial. Mercy needs a receipt. At one point, he reads canon numbers aloud while tapping his pencil, and when he pronounces digits that match my social registry, I feel a peculiar lurch, ink aligning with flesh. He tells a story about a nuncio who vanished while overseeing interdicted dispatches, officially dispatched for containment, unofficially erased. The language smooths over disappearance with procedure. Erasure wears the grammar of administration. I should have stopped when he said countdown. The word landed like a verdict. Instead, I keep taking notes because knowledge feels like armor. I write folio numbers, phrases that read like recipes. Perform at dusk, sound bell thrice, remit postscript. The instructions are antiseptic on the page, barbaric when practiced. A recording that murmurs whether becomes a protocol when paired with schedule and seal. He explains appeals as bureaucratic forms. There are petitions, he says, but they require witness, attestation, and ritual appropriation. A name cannot simply be removed. Removal is an action with signatures and verification. To petition is to enter the ledger. Families can request review. Rarely does the subject petition. The conditions read like a trap. To be known is to risk becoming data in someone else's calculus. I watch his hands. The ring on his finger, a small band with a cross recessed to anonymity, seems to drink the bulb's light. When he touches the ledger, the metal makes no sound, but the motion looks like a benediction. It bothers me that the ring has no inscription. A nameless signifier marks those who administer the ledger. I suddenly feel foolish for thinking curiosity could remain private. He mentions remediation teams as if they were municipal workers painting over a wall at dawn. Remediation, he says, is the act of closing a file. We quarantine, we document, we perform the rite that aligns the register. The vocabulary reforms mercy into maintenance. I imagine men with clipboards replacing history with notation. When he asks why I have the tape, I cannot answer without sounding like an informant or a fool. He studies my face as if reading marginalia. Some tapes, he says, are more useful than others. A voice that predates adult diction carries patterns. It is easier to anchor ritual to a child's utterance. The sentence lodges like a splinter. The ledger had already written my habits in ecclesiastical ink, and now the archivist explains how my voice might be used. I wander the stacks after he leaves because the ledger's language clings to me like lint. Boxes sit in rows like a city grid. Each label becomes a street sign, each signature a name the place remembers. Clerks in low light pass forms, stamping impressions into paper with the polite brutality of administrators. There is a peculiar intimacy to routine. The more methodical the process, the more private the violence becomes. Domenico hinted that ordinary channels are repurposed as vectors. A radio bulletin, a weather report, a child's cassette. Once written into the ledger, they can carry ritual. I think of the tape's metaphors broadcast over local waves. A forecast that reads as a benediction, a drizzle reinterpreted into forgetting. How many broadcasts must one hear before realizing the forecast is instruction? There is craft in what they do, linguistic engineering, institutional collaboration. It is not sorcery so much as careful work. Technicians, conservators, committees signing forms, archivists acting as gatekeepers. Language can be conserved and weaponized when placed under seal. Walking home that night, I watch windows instead of streetlights. Ordinary conversation flattens into background noise. A mention of rain tightens my stomach. I think of the nuncio who fell off the grid and imagine remediation as patient surgery. A file closed, a seal pressed, a small administrative death. The ledger treats absence as an entry, and that formalization is what makes removal acceptable to those who perform it. The next day I watch other archivists at work. Their gestures are devotion disguised as discipline. The angle at which a page is turned, the way gloves are rolled back. The training must reiterate a temperament that turns affection into detachment. When mercy is rendered in checklists, the actor's intent becomes secondary to the action. I should have stopped when he recited those canon numbers that matched my life. I did not. I carry the ledger's language like a bruise, recensus, interdiction, remediation. Namming the method makes it portable. Knowledge was my anesthetic, and like all cheap anesthetics, it wore off and left me naked to the procedure. The vault's iron door closed behind me as I left, and the echo sounded like a seal pressed into vellum. Procedures can be prayers. Mercy can be measured with a pencil. An archive is not only a place of memory, but also a place that reads and decides. That is the ledger's quiet terror. I do not yet know which column bears my name. The cassette plays a baptism not like a sermon, but as if read from an administrative office. Concise, efficient, designed to be recorded and filed. The priest's voice is steady. The congregation on the tape is a thin rustle. At first I think it is a parish I have never visited. The bell that tolls on the recording does not match the bells of my neighborhood. Then, as I listen longer, the voice reading the rite becomes familiar. It is shaped like my own, a childhood cadence folded into Latin pronunciations I do not remember learning. Hearing that younger register of my voice sewn into a liturgy feels obscene, like discovering someone has read the margin notes of your life aloud. The water on the recording has a sound that unsettles, not the soft plash of holy water dabbed by a fingertip, but a steady mechanical hiss, like a pump pressed to keep a basin moving. When the voice says, "In nomen Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti," the words land through that machinery as if filtered through a grate. Under the prayer is a low, rhythmic undertone that organizes syllables into a pattern. A benediction becomes an instruction. The cassette reads rubrics as coordinates, phrases that for liturgists would be obscure, for engineers would be schematic. "At the hour of forgetting," it says, and the clause sits in me like a stone. I should have stopped when my reflection in the window no longer matched the voice on the player. I stood with the cassette in my lap, coat half-zipped, watching the glass. The person in the pane mouthed the prayer a fraction of a beat behind the tape, and her eyes looked smaller, tired in a way that made me feel the glass had taken something of me. Instead of switching the machine off, I pulled on my shoes and went into the rain. I tell you this because the way curiosity feels at first, like agency, like light, soon becomes a route toward danger when it leads you into other people's procedures. The parish building sits where the city thins into older streets, where cobbles remember horses and ironwork remembers rain. The great door is sealed with red wax and stamped with a diocesan impression. It is a seal that speaks of review, not burglary. A brass plaque names a parish I have never known. Through the transom, the font shows itself. Carved stone, dark pool, the water lying like a closed eye. The wet brass letters on the plaque blur under the rain until they look like hand script. Standing there, I feel less like an investigator than an intruder at the threshold of a file. I find a side door that yields and slip in. The nave smells of resin and damp pages. Hymnals lie open in the exact places the cassette emphasizes, certain litanies, an obscure suffrage, a penitential responsory. The pews look recently used. A child's scarf hangs draped and damp. The font's rim is carved with looping marks that are not the usual vines and wheat, but something deliberate and script-like. The water's surface is reflective, yet stubbornly evasive. When I lean over it, I do not see myself clearly, but an arrangement of features that answers like a face made of ledger lines. A priest meets me in the sanctuary. He is older than his collar allows and has ink smudges on his fingers, the kind of small stains that tell you he has been reading many margins. When I tell him about the cassette and repeat the phrase, the hour of forgetting, he inclines his head as if checking a schedule on a wall. He speaks of it clinically, explaining that sometimes sacraments are performed or recorded under methods that do not correspond to ordinary pastoral practice. There are times, he says, when registrar methods are used to bind acts to places that must be accounted for. His voice lacks piety, it has the measured cadence of policy. From a locked drawer he produces a player and another tape. He presses play and the baptism begins again, but this playback carries a new seam beneath the chanting, a low whir, like gears settling into place. The priest calls the phenomenon nominative displacement. The phrase is calm and exact. He tells me without melodrama that part of the archive's work has become experimental, to attach names in different locales so that absence and presence can be balanced administratively. A name can be anchored to a place it never belonged to, and by doing so the ledger is made to breathe in a different pattern. Who was baptized into my silence? I ask because the question has become a wound I can no longer ignore. The priest answers with the ledger's language rather than a pastoral idiom, entries marked, sequenced, remitted, sealed. He mentions a nuncio who once supervised interdicted items and later failed to present for a scheduled audit. The disappearance is spoken of like a missing record, an irregularity, an omission to be reconciled. The calm with which he speaks of erasure is the cruelest thing. It renders absence administratively neat. He refuses to hand me paperwork. His drawer contains the player and the smell of old wax, and he explains instead how registries operate. Baptisms can anchor rituals to different places. Ledgers can note which names have been moved. Procedures require witness, attestation, and ritual appropriation. There are stamps and seals and dates, and the signatures of men whose job is to make absence legible. The mechanics are banal, which is why they terrify. The intimacy of a sacrament becomes an item to be reconciled in a balance sheet of mercy. I set my palm on the font's cold lip. The carved stone resists my touch with an indifferent chill. When I look into the water, the surface answers with a face that is not entirely mine. It is an arrangement that recognizes me in a way that feels like a registry reading. There is no miracle here, only the logic of systems. Someone composed syllables into a rite, someone scheduled a moment and signed it into a register, and now the font holds the record of that displacement in its glassy face. To recognize, that is to realize the apparatus, can use names as ballast. Walking home, I repeat the phrase, hour of forgetting, like a bead on a rosary, as if repetition might armor me. It does not. I replay the cassette in my room because the compulsion to know breeds the illusion of control. My younger voice pronounces lines I do not remember learning, and beneath it the same mechanical undertone persists, industry, not devotion. The recording does not repent, it reports. It lays out an arithmetic in which names are variables to be moved, balanced, and closed. I should have stopped when the first bell on the tape did not match my city. I did not, and that choice matters. I have learned there is a calculus behind mercy. Someone tallies names and arranges absence as if balancing a ledger. So I ask again, harder, who was baptized into my silence, and what account did that absence pay? The cassette offers no answer, only the patient arithmetic of a system that continues its accounting, and I remain on the side where numbers can be moved without a witness. Still. I press the tape in the palm of my hand like a sacrament, feeling the little ridge where the label peels and the plastic has been polished by someone else's thumb. When I first played it, I expected a clumsy sermon, an old homily, the cough of a parishioner, the domestic noise that humanizes a voice. Instead, the first thing that fills the room is a papal cadence, measured vowels, a lento that shapes the air like a canopy. It has the weight of vestments, and the particular gravity of someone who has learned to make words occupy a room. It speaks of misericordia and prudence, and of stewardship in a voice that asks no witness to its authority. Beneath that canopy my voice follows, folded into the seams like a marginal note that should never have been allowed to annotate a master text. The Pope's voice, or the artful simulacrum of it, says misericordia as if reciting a statute. Then my voice follows in the gap and reads clauses that feel like clauses of a contract. Names, conditions, mechanisms. The edited speech names an indulgence, but not the small indulgence of a pilgrim's certificate. The indulgence promised is systemic, an institutional facility that offers remission in exchange for administrative arrangements. The words are careful. In extraordinary circumstance, for the preservation of the common good, the Apostolic Curia may authorize remittance under specified protocols. The sentence is dressed in theology and then laid bare as a policy, mercy conditional upon ledgering. I should have stopped when the city's bells answered the tape on the hour. The first time it felt like coincidence. The cassette paused, and the cathedral bell chimed once, the sounds dovetailing into an uncanny harmony. But when every church in the quarter chimed in a triple cadence that matched the recorded phrase, the coincidence hardened into a pattern. When sound from a plastic cassette began to organize the clockwork of the place, curiosity ceased to be an innocent faculty. Still I followed the trail the old man had given me, folio references, docket numbers, marginalia, and the indulgence's breadcrumb trail led to a folio in a section of the archive where the paper smelled of wax and insurance. Tucked between conservation notes and delivery receipts was a small bound manuscript titled, in cramped Latin, De Mercibus Oblivionis, on the accounting of forgetting. It does not read as scripture so much as an administrative manual written by clerks who took theology as a problem to be solved. The folio lists conditions, crisis, contagion, scandal, in blunt categories a bureaucracy prefers. It lists mechanisms, recensus, remissio, sequela. There are checkboxes, witness lines, instruction headings, perform right A at dusk, obtain witnesses X, Y, Z, file docket 47. The prose's tone is sober, the kind of dry prose you reserve for budgets and quarantines. Reading felt like standing beside men who reconcile markets. The indulgence described in the taped speech is enacted through ledgering. Names selected, entries appended, seals impressed. The register aims not at annihilation, but at administrative isolation. A name moved into the interdicted column is not metaphysically deleted so much as sequestered, a social quarantine. The folio argues, with appalling clarity, that to preserve the broader order you may reassign visibility. Some names will remain part of communal narrative. Others will be legally noted as absent to preserve the functioning unit. Mercy becomes triage. There is monstrous practicality to it. A council convenes, doctrinal officers, civic liaisons, juridical experts. Then the committee signs. The folio instructs, collect names, perform the liturgy, obtain attestations, seal records. The ritual of governance is as banal as it is terrible. Vestments become ceremonial coveralls. Prayers are accompanied by forms that must be initialed and witnessed. When I read it, I felt the peculiar, sliding chill of something modern. Not a cult, ritual, but administrative technology applied to souls. I should have stopped when I saw marginalia that matched my registry. I did not. My dates, the parish of my baptism, the signatures that appear in public records are cross-referenced with blunt inked annotations that remark on eligibility and sequence. Someone has traced my life like a map and annotated it with clerical shorthand. It is one thing to be a reader of documents and another thing to find yourself a datum. Panic is an involuntary animal. At first I felt confusion, paper dust, and the sour tang of disbelief. Then something like the slow release of a cord that binds. The ledger's footnotes had my coordinates. The edited speech itself choreographs consent. The papal voice frames the indulgence with moral language, prudence, care for the common good, while my younger voice appears, threaded like a marginal gloss, consenting in a manner that chills me to the bone. The cassette shows how to manufacture acquiescence. Pair a voice that commands respect with a voice that sounds like it belongs to the subject, and you have the semblance of voluntary assent. The recording makes the ledger humane. It is an apparatus designed to show procedure and therefore ethical cover. When I asked the archivist who legislates this apparatus, they shrugged with the practiced boredom of men who have watched institutions develop rituals of self-preservation. It is delegated, one said, listing committees. Doctrinal, civic liaison, juridical, each title a small lever for moral distance. Delegation is a solvent for responsibility. If a process is in place and committees sign, then culpability diffuses. I watched witness signatures collected with the same calm hand used to endorse loans or probate. Seals are impressed into vellum, and the sound snaps like a verdict. The ritual of administrative closure makes everything seem inevitable. I tried to appeal. The petition is polite and labyrinthine and requires witnesses who will attest to continuity of identity. The archivist told me the petition must route through parish, civic office, and doctrinal review, a process measured in months, possibly years. Mercy, he said, must be regulated lest it become arbitrary. The banality of the phrase is a blade. Mercy needs paperwork, and paperwork needs time. Time is what the ledger buys itself to complete the work. If the highest voice can promise mercy in exchange for forgetting, what becomes of conscience? The ledger recasts moral theology into policy, and in that transformation culpability is handed to forms. I keep thinking of the papal cadence pronouncing a contract and my voice answering like a footnote. I keep hearing the bells keep time to some docket. I should have stopped when the bells first answered the tape. I did not, and now I carry the burden. I should have stopped when the bells first answered the tape. I did not, and now I carry the burden. There is a week when the city itself seems to be learning a new silence. It comes on gradually at first, a hesitation in the clink of cafe cups, a gap in the chorus of pigeons, so that the first time I notice I think I am inventing absence out of nerves. Then the absences accrete into evidence. A marble saint in the plaza whose eyes once caught sunlight now holds hollows that swallow it. Votive candles inside chapels drawing lean, crooked tongues instead of the steady lamplight I remember. Confessionals whose doors, once reliable, now groan as if resisting an unseen wind. The change is small enough to be denied and large enough to be undeniable, the sort of thing that rewrites comfort into dread without fanfare. I take the long way home because movement is a way to postpone thought. The river smells different. The damp under the bridge is colder. A statue of a bishop I have known since childhood stands with hands arranged in benediction. But when I look closely, there are little smudges in the stone where eyes used to be, an abrasion, as if someone had taken a tool to the face and scraped out what watched. The dogs around the corner no longer bark at the sacristan who passes with his satchel. They watch him with the wary civility they reserve for strangers. It is as though the city is learning the grammar of omission. I should have stopped when the rector of San Paulo locked his office and said, "We are late," as if sharing a calendar rather than admitting dread. His mouth made the phrase small and domestic. His hands, when he clasped them, trembled in the way of someone who has rehearsed composure and lost it. I asked what he meant, and he smiled the kind of smile that has learned to carry secrets politely. "There are schedules," he said, "and then there are revisions. Our work has been lent elsewhere." He did not elaborate, but his voice carried the tired rhythm of a man who knows an appointment is not merely a time, but an obligation with teeth. After that I began to track extinguishments like one might track weather. Candles in chapels that had burned for decades guttered and extinguished overnight. Votive shrines that had been tended by the same family across generations were left with their glassy offerings unpolished. The wax pooled in strange, directional flows, like a tide leaving a shoreline carved in the shape of a name. I photographed them because boys who grow into archivists habitually document. Photography is a ritual of evidence. The images look like a corrosion study, edges worn in regular bands, patterns repeated like cipher keys. Someone, or something, was reading prayers and erasing them not from books, but from the place where they were held. Curiosity brought me to the confessional boxes on a washed-out Thursday, when the rain was the kind that limps rather than paws. Doors that once rattled like old men now closed like shutters. I slid into a booth and waited for the creak of confession, the private human murmur that has always comforted me with its ordinary humility. Instead, I heard a kind of static under the wood, a whisper that was not a voice so much as the sense of a clause being torn from a sentence. It sounded like paper being peeled from a wet page. I pressed my palm to the wooden lattice and felt warmth where there should have been cool. The lattice thrummed with a vibration that answered to no bell I have ever known. When I asked the sacristan about it, he looked at me as if trying to recall which life we were in. He spoke in a voice that had learned how to be unremarkable out of necessity. "We are closing registers," he said, and that phrasing, closing registers, arranged the world into ledgers again. He told me in halting terms that some prayers had been classified as redundant, contagions of doubt, and that protocol demanded their removal. "It is for the peace of the whole," he said. He used the same administrative language I had seen in Domenico's ledger. Mercy becomes municipal when bureaucrats explain why silence must be enforced. I should have stopped when the parish council presented their revisions. I did not. I argued quietly at first, then with a small, swelling arrogance that comes from believing in the restorative power of speech. I said prayers are not merely words, they are mappings of desire. To remove them was to excise pathways. The council listened in the Oval Room, and then with the polite efficiency of committees, took their vote. They wore the decision like an old coat, not excited, not cruel, merely done. They had discovered a particular logic. If prayers can be unmade, then behavior can be redirected. If behavior is redirected, the ledger's balance becomes easier to maintain. On the third night, the statues stopped moving. I do not mean they ceased to be sculptures. Stone does not animate in that way. But their posture shifted in small increments over the course of an hour, as if they were following a new liturgy. The Madonna in the square, whose hands always cupped a rosary, now held nothing at all. Those fingers had been smoothed into the suggestion of absence. When I looked at the marble children clustered at the base of a saint, their mouths that had once formed open prayers were sealed tight, and the effect was the same as closing a book mid-sentence. There was an economy to the gesture. Remove the gesture, and the prayer that depended on it cannot be spoken. People noticed, and they noticed poorly. The mayor made a statement about maintenance. A columnist wrote about the effects of pollution on stonework and called for restoration funds. News is excellent at domestication. It gives language to strangeness that makes the public sigh and return to routine. But those who come to light the votives, the old women with their grocery bags, the young men who leave single coins, started to hesitate. Their hands hovered and retreated like animals at a boundary. Attendance at nightly Compline dropped an inch each day, as if the community were leaning away from a table it had once gathered around. I began to see the ledger's hand in everything. The removal of prayer is not simply metaphysical, it is operational. To make a prayer impossible, you do not necessarily have to banish belief. You can make the action by which belief is expressed untenable. Remove the candle, and the hand that would light it loses its ritual. Close the confessional, and confession becomes an act that cannot be fulfilled. Smooth the statue's eyes, and the worshipper who sought a gaze to hold will find only a blank. It is merciless weeding, the gardener thinking themselves kind because they prune without announcing the root. In the end, it is the small things I remember best. The smell of a chapel where incense no longer catches. The way streetlights seem to hesitate when the church bells do not ring their usual cadence. I replay the tape sometimes and listen for the background. Those seams between phrases where the ledger whispers its ordinances. When the voice on the cassette reads a name, it is followed by a current of air that feels like a door closing somewhere in the city. I tell myself I should have stopped when the rector said, "We are late." But the truth is more ordinary and more damning. I wanted to know how the unmaking felt. Knowledge felt like a tool, and tools are always used. Now, when I walk past a chapel, I check the shadow of the statue and the way the wick leans. My hands itch to scrape, to restore, and I have no right. The ledger is not a single man's instrument. It is an entire system that learned to tidy language into an economy. Prayers that can be unmade are not merely lost, they are converted into entries. I keep thinking of the children with sealed mouths at the saints' feet, and I wonder what will become of the people whose names the ledger has deemed inconvenient. If a prayer can be erased from flesh, what remains to call an oath? I tell myself to keep a record, to photograph and note and resist, but resistance feels like a single candle in a chapel that has learned not to burn. I should have stopped when the rector said, "We are late," but I did not, and now every statue's sealed mouth feels like an indictment I was slow to read. The folio was not where the catalogue said it would be. That, I think now, is the first small lie an archive tells. Indexes are promises you learn to distrust the instant they fail you. I found the book behind a false cleat in a low shelf, shoved back as if someone had tried to hide a thing from the light, and then reconsidered and left it where a careless eye might eventually find it. The binding was sulphur dark and tacky, as though the leather itself had sweated its shame. When I lifted the cover, a smell rose, rot and copper, the breath of things that have been closed too long. The smell alone should have made me put it back. Instead, it made me lean forward. The entries are not written with ink so much as with an abrasion of soot and grief. The script trembles like hands that have been taught to write while holding a memory too heavy to bear. Letters bow under strain. Someone had written and then impressed, dragged a blunt implement across the page until the graphite settled into grooves, and when I ran my fingers along them, they left a smear on my skin like a transferred sin. The surface was furred with ash, as if the folio had been warmed against a hearth that had been fed with other books. Where someone else would have used a stamp, the author here had pressed the page with a blunt finger, and the residue made letters rise like braille. My name, is there, repeated under different rubrics. Bless, remit, seal. Each rubric behaves like a header on a ledger, but the columns are wrong. Instead of numbers and addresses, there are instructions and timestamps that do not belong to me. Dates appear that preceded me, as if someone had allocated me months and years like a budget item. Beside each entry, in a small precise hand, there are marginalia, verbs that read like recipes: performatio noct, vocum infantis registrea, oratio inversa post benedictionem. The Latin is clumsy, chopped at the seams, as if scribes who were not priests had been taught to translate intention into procedure. I should have stopped when the ink smelled of rot. The phrase tastes like cowardice and a confession at once, because stopping would have been my salvation if only I had accepted the simple moral muscle of refusal. But my fingers betrayed me. They followed the braille of ash and the graphite ridges with the clumsy intimacy of someone who thinks touching is understanding. The raised letters made a map my skin could read. By the time I knew how dangerous it was, my fingertips were black with soot and something like recognition. The marginal notes are instructions for an apparatus that is obscene in its neatness. One line reads, "Subject's own confession required, record at dawn, reverse playback at noon." Another, "Witness X to attest, witness Y to sign, seal with wax marked Ecclesia Terminata." Beneath these is a notation so small I had to squint. Vox infantis preferred, patterns stable. My mouth filled with the metallic taste of bile because I understood then what previously I had only suspected. They prefer a young voice for the way it imprints. The ledger does not merely record, it requisitions. There is a page where my name is followed by the phrase, pre-uttered. The line beneath it is a date that would have made me too young to remember, months when the city was a different climate, and my parents still called me by a nickname no one else used. It should be impossible for my life to intersect that annotation, and yet paper is stubborn, and people find ways to shoehorn truth into forms they understand. Whoever wrote this ledger had the nerve to place me into time before I could claim it. They assign me presents as if they were a registrar at some cosmic registry. I call Dominico because that is what people do when the world arranges itself like a bureaucracy. They consult the men who know the margins. He came with his coat folded at the collar and the practiced calm of someone for whom oddities are escalations rather than surprises. He turned the pages slowly, as if running his thumb over the spine might make the book confess its origin. When he read the marginalia, his face did not change much. He is a man who has been made to accept too much, but a small tremor moved at the corner of his mouth. They record patterns, he said, not explaining but nodding. The ledger takes a template and makes it replicable. It is a taxonomy of absence. He sounded like a man reading minutes from a meeting he had not agreed to attend. I asked how they could know voice patterns before a child's speech settled. He tapped the folio with a careful index and said, "They use recordings. Early phonemes are captured and used as anchors." He did not say who they were. He spoke the word as if it were a machine, collective and unblinking. I thought of mothers humming over cradles, of voices that teach vowels into being. The ledger's cruelty is not merely in namming you as absent, but in manufacturing the instrument that will make you assent. If a child's recorded utterance can be grafted onto a liturgy, then the ledger achieves the simulacrum of consent. It is the difference between being seen and being constituted. There was a folded slip of paper pressed inside the back cover, brittle with age. It contained a single notation in a different hand. Procedure appended. See tape index 3. I should have left the folio there, in that dim shelf where false cleats hide truth and hands are less greedy. Instead, I lifted the cover and found beneath the notation a small loop of magnetic tape, like a black tongue tucked into the binding. When I unwound it, because I am the kind of fool who believes listening will satisfy a hunger, the ribbon whispered like dry leaves. The sound was my childhood voice, thin as paper, halting syllables that should have been my firsts. A vowel, a broken consonant, a laugh that was not yet formed into language. The recording sounded intimate in a way that made me want to lock the door and take the book to the river and burn it until the black letters were only smoke. Who recorded me before I learned to speak? The ledger gave me process without provenance, the how without the who. The marginalia explained techniques, reverse playback, liturgical inversion, timing with bell sequences, but they do not confess the hand that arranged them. There are references to committees and seals and to field operatives, a phrasing so modern it made me think of men in plain coats and wet shoes moving quietly through chapels at dawn. It is administrative. They schedule, they call witnesses, they place names like chess pieces. That night I slept badly, the ledger under my pillow like a guilty talisman. When I dreamed, fingers traced the grooves of the raised letters across my face, and the syllables I had heard on the tape looped in the air. I woke certain that the folio had taught my hands a small literacy. Now when I move my fingers across surfaces, I half expect them to decode some hidden rubric. In the kitchen, light the ash on my fingertips caught and flared like a cautionary lantern. There is a particular cruelty in the ledger's tactility. It anticipates touch. Braille is meant to translate seeing into reading for the blind. Ash Braille in this folio translates paper into accusation for those who dare to feel. I ran a thumb over my name and felt the hollow where a ridge had been. The ash left a smear that matched the mark of the men who had pressed it there. The ledger has my history in a hand I did not recognize, and the history asserts itself when I touch it. I should have stopped when the ink smelled of rot. I did not. The ledger has my name in columns that predate me, a tape loop tucked inside to teach my voice, to say what will later be framed as confession. Somewhere, some committee textually ordained the performance of my assent before I had the language to give it. The ledger reads like a contract written in a language I cannot yet refuse, and each time my fingers pass over the ash, I feel the margin close a fraction more. I should have stopped when the ink smelled of rot, but I traced the marginalia with my fingers, and now the ledger's ash knows the shape of my name as if it had always been waiting for my touch. There are confessions that break you like weather and confessions that break you like accounting. I thought I knew the difference until the night Father Angelo requested the tape as a condition for hearing me. He did not phrase it as a demand, but as a procedural necessity, an odd little clerical courtesy. Yet the wording carried the officious air of men who have come to treat souls as files. "Bring the recording," he said, "and I will hear you. Otherwise I cannot be certain of the form." The phrase sounded like a juridical clause. In his mouth, the sacrament became a checklist. We met in the chapel after Compline when the parish was quiet and the candles had guttered down to honest stubs. He led me into the small confessional beneath the choir loft, where the wood still remembered the hands of generations. He closed the panel and sat across from me in the dark, the lattice between us a thin, conspiratorial veil. He asked only that I place the cassette on the little shelf. "This is not common practice," he said. "But in unusual matters, an exceptional rubric applies." He said rubric as if it were a lamp to be turned on and off. When he pressed play, the tape did not begin with my voice. It started with a bell, blunt and measured, then a chant that sounded like a public proclamation wrapped in ecclesiastical husk. The papal cadence I had come to know as a craft smoothed the recording into a homily. Then my voice entered as a child's voice usually enters a memory, soft at the edges, uncertain, and then unnervingly precise. I listened as a cataloguer listens to a damaged tape, measuring each anomaly, and realized with a cold clarity that the form the priest was following in the confessional matched the recorded liturgy line for line. He read from a small, printed sheet, the rubrics, and every clause he mouthed had a twin on the cassette. The coincidence was not accidental. The printed liturgy and the recording were twin scripts of the same performance. What the tape called a last confession was not the ordinary sacrament the faithful confess in shame and hope. It was an engineered rite. The voice on the tape named acts I had not yet committed with the smooth inevitability of a weather forecast. On the 15th of March, the tape intoned in my younger register, "The subject will withhold a witness." And when I protested, because how could I be guilty of an act that had not occurred, the priest did not lift his eyes. He continued, following the sheet, "Confess to withholding, for the withholding has already been recorded." The language turned temporal order into an algorithm. Prediction became indictment. I should have stopped the moment the priest reached the page that listed me by name. There was a small line in the margin where someone had penciled a note, sequitur. The priest paused and ran his finger along the paper like a man checking a seam. He looked at me then with something like pity, and perhaps pity is worse than anger because pity assumes you are already a loss. "Absolution is a form," he murmured in a voice that had been softened by years of catechizing doubt. "It is also an attestation. The office requires witness." The language was maddeningly banal. Clerical language does this. It anesthetizes horror with ordinariness. I begged. The confession took the shape of pleading. I told him I did not know these acts. I said I had not yet withheld a witness. I had not yet signed a document that erases someone. I had not yet learned to look away. His answer was to place the printed rubric beside the player and read the clauses precisely as they were spoken on the tape. Each time he said a verb, it landed in the air like a small, metallic object. I am told to confess what the tape asserts, because the tape grants prophetic authority by already possessing the record. The confessional became less a space of mercy than an apparatus to harmonize voice and ledger. It is difficult to explain the way presence shifts when a man chooses procedure over pastoral care. Father Angelo did not look like a villain. His collar was clean, his hands steady, the sort of hands that had baptized infants and been forgiven the same human smallness 1,000 times. Yet he read the rubric as if the tape had ordained him to be both judge and servant. When I tried to ask whether this was not abuse of the right, he answered with the sort of scholarly calm that makes the most dangerous things seem inevitable. "If the recording is authentic and the liturgy conforms," he said, "then this confession is valid in form." Valid in form, not in charity. The distinction felt like a slow, surgical reduction. How does one confess when the contents of guilt are given to you in advance? The mechanics are insidious. The tape reduces possibility into a script and then requires the subject to enact the script to achieve closure. The ledger and the liturgy conspire. One names the offenses, the other provides the ritual to close them. The subject becomes complicit in their own erasure because the act of confessing is used as the instrument of sealing. I tried to argue that confession is meant to be an act of contrition, not a performance of inevitability. He listened as if I were making a theological point, and then, with the tired courtesy of a man who has memorized dissent, said, "Contrition can be formalized." When my voice on the tape read a sin I had not yet committed, my body reacted as if learning to say the word summoned it into being. I felt the syllable shape in me like a muscle finding use. The acoustics of the confessional pressed the recorded syllable into my ear, and the sensation of somebody else's prophecy settling into my bones was like frost. I should have stopped then and refused to speak the lines. Refusal might have been messy, it might have been dangerous, but it would have been an act of self-determination. Instead, I repeated the phrases because the ritual demanded it, because the liturgy was a machine and I had become a cog. Afterwards, when the bell in the tower marked the late hour and the church emptied so slowly it seemed like a drained room, Father Angelo folded the printed rubric and returned it to me with a hand that was almost tender. "Keep it," he said. "It is your attestation." The words made me nauseous because an attestation is normally a testimony of truth. Here it served as a receipt that I had performed my own binding. He looked at me with the kind of pity I have learned to distrust. Pity that assumes one is already a problem to be managed rather than a person to be guided. Leaving the confessional, I felt less absolved than annexed. The tape had been played, the words said, the signatures implied by presence. The ledger upstairs would have another entry tonight, performed, attested, closed. I had come seeking mercy and found instead a mechanism that turned my voice into evidence against my future. I keep replaying that moment in my head, the crackle of plastic, the priest's small cough of procedural approval, my own voice answering a schedule, and I cannot tell whether I was confessing my sins to God or confessing myself into the ledger's column. I should have stopped when the printed liturgy matched the tape verbatim. I did not, and now every time I speak aloud I am haunted by the sense that my words will be pressed into a page elsewhere and counted as things that have already happened. Am I confessing to unmake what the ledger promises, or is the confessional a device designed to make me pronounce the terms that seal my absence? I walk home with the rubric folded in my pocket, its corners sharp as a legal notice, and the sound of the tape still in my ears, the bell, the papal cadence, and my own child's voice spelling out acts I have not yet done. I begged for absolution and left with the rubric folded in my pocket. Whether I begged God or petitioned a ledger, I still do not know which voice will speak next with my name. I bring the tape to the hearth because destruction feels like agency. The archivist's burn pile is a civic ritual wrapped in secrecy. Padded boxes, field slips, the small archive docket stuffed into envelopes and fed to flame. Matteo once said, "Ash gives you a ledger you can read with clean hands." He was wrong. I stand before the hearth in the empty back room where old missals and condemned pamphlets go to become heat, and I feel the ridiculous hope that flame can end what paper could not. The tape curls black under my thumb. I strike a match, and the wax light leans toward the ribbon like a votive toward a saint. For a second the flame seems holy. It edges the plastic and makes an honest, animal smell of melting. The first flare eats the label and adhesive. The ribbon softens and unwinds as if reluctant to end. When the plastic surrenders, it peels away in a smoky strip, and I drop it into the coals. The sound is small, a little sigh. The tape collapses into embers, and for a moment I imagine relief. But smoke rises and carries with it odd shapes that are almost letters. At first I tell myself I am frantic, delirious from weeks of listening and ledger reading. Yet the smoke writes with a patience that mimics handwriting. A curved edge, a letter half formed, then a blurring into soot. My fingers come away dusted black with residue that is not just ash but a smear of meaning. I should have stopped when the ash spelled the name of the street where I spent my childhood, Via Città Alta, because that was the point when destruction ceased to be neutral and became indexical. Instead, I lean closer. The soot rearranges itself as if aware of being watched. Ridges shift and align into a schedule, dates and curt phrases like commands, remit 311, seal 514, watch 702. My heart performs a small mechanical hop. One of those dates is tomorrow. The coals cool and the ritual continues in residue. Fire did not terminate the instruction, it transposed it. The ash reads back as if braille for an archivist's hand, letters settling in my palm like a chorus of small mouths. I dig through the embers with tongs because logic demands proof. The coals yield a black crust that flakes like skin. Within the ash, there are impressions of letters and tiny shapes: a ring, a cross, a seal. I have seen these marks in ledgers, de mercibus oblivionis, catalogue marks for action, not mere ornament. The archive has taught these marks to be legible across substances: ribbon, vellum, now soot. If the record survives the flame, then the ritual anticipates destruction. The system is redundant by design. Fear arrives as small certainties. Perhaps the men who arranged the ledger were archivists and conservators who understood chemistry as well as canon, men who encoded records to persist even if someone attempted to destroy them. If so, the ledger's logic is elegant and merciless. Burn the object, and the medium will translate, carrying the instruction into a new register. The ritual becomes infrastructure. Outside, the church bell answers on the hour with a cadence that now feels like punctuation. The bell tone corresponds to the pattern printed in the ash. The city harmonizes like an instrument. The mechanism is not localized to a hearth and a folio. It is distributed across tapes, ledgers, bells, and now smoke. Each component translates the instruction into another material language. I can no longer believe in isolated acts of resistance. The archive has woven contingency into its seams. I think of burning as a final act of speech, but ash speaks differently. The soot's schedule reads like a clerk delivering morning tasks to a nervous office. One of the entries bears my name again, with a verb beside it: observe. The ledger wants witnesses to their own erasure. The archive requires an audience that will attest to absence. The idea is perverse. The act of watching is folded into the mechanism of removal so that spectatorship becomes submission. I should have stopped when the ash spelled my street. I did not, and because I did not, I watched smoke crawl up the chimney and articulate into a cadence the city accepts. Men file forms, priests sign parchment, clerks note times. Mundane acts performed at a distance are small gears in a machine that renders life into line items. Up close, the ledger is not a book, but a distributed apparatus. It survives attempts at destruction because its logic expects them. I bargain with the hearth like a child asking a god for mercy. Take it all, I say to the coals absurdly, as if flame can choose. Take my voice, only stop the ledger. The flame shudders and gives a last small blossom of orange, as if mocking the bargain. The impressions remain. My fingers trace the ridges, and one of the dates slides an hour forward under my touch. Time, apparently, is negotiable when you are dealing with an apparatus designed to record and reassign. When I step outside the building, the night is altered. The air carries the geometry of the hearth's translation. It hums with the ledger's cadence. People pass by, shoulders raised against rain, and none of them look at me as if they would notice ash on my hands. I wash my fingers in a public fountain, and the water beads oddly, as if aware that ash is not meant to be diluted. The soap leaves a faint outline that fades like an editorial correction. The tape is gone. The cassette's teeth are swallowed, and the plastic has melted into something unrecognizable. I expected obliteration and instead received transcription. The archive's processes are redundant. When one medium fails, another carries the content forward. If burning cannot end the ritual, then ritual persists as infrastructure. Mercy, in that sense, becomes a system of trade-offs. Someone lists names in one column and erases them in another, balance maintained by absence. I press my palms together until the ash smudges my nails. The city hums its obedient cadence. Voices, mine, the priest's, the simulated papal tone, are instruments within a ledger's orchestra. The tape is gone. A new medium keeps the score. Who will speak next with my voice? I feel suddenly small as an entry on a docket, a fragile line of ink waiting to be shifted. In the end, there is no clean burning, no absolution by flame, only the ledger's patience and the city's obedient hum. I thought that if I destroyed the tape, I would end it. Instead, I learned that erasure can be a transfer. The ash reads back, and the ledger listens. The last sound I hear as I close the door behind me is not the pop of coals, but the faint mechanical click of a seal being impressed somewhere in town. A small administrative sound that, to me, reads like a verdict. I tuck the scorched ribbon into my coat as evidence, though evidence means nothing here. I walk into a city that names me in its hush, and wherever a bell answers, I hear the ledger rehearsing my disappearance. I walk into a city that names me in its hush, and wherever a bell answers, I hear the ledger rehearsing my disappearance.